Okay, well, good morning, everybody. This is Vivek here, continuing a series of Aftermarket Champions podcast. Today's guest is Chris Sandiford, who's the president of the Heating and Refrigeration Division of GEA in North America. Chris has been known to us for many, many years, and Chris has been a customer of ours for a few years now. And I'm especially delighted to welcome him to today's podcast because, like many of our guests, he's had an interesting career journey into aftermarket and out of aftermarket. And so I wanted to invite Chris to kind of share his story, share some of the learnings through the aftermarket experience that he had, and kind of get some insight into what he's thinking about, not just career next, but the role he's playing today as the president of the HRT division of GEA. So with that, welcome, Chris. Thank you for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to see you. It's always fun to chat with you, and I'm looking forward to the next 30, 35 minutes with you today.
Thank you, Vivek. Likewise, always a pleasure to talk with you too.
Great. So, Chris, what I typically do with most of our guests is just kind of get the introduction a bit. I kind of gave a very short 10, 15-second introduction on your current role. Maybe you can give us a little bit of a story about Chris. Who's Chris? Where did he come from? How did he wind up in the aftermarket job? And, what is Chris doing today? So maybe a little bit of a Chris story, if you don't mind.
Sure. I don't want to go back too far, Vivek, but grew up in the south coast of England, studied chemical engineering, University of Surrey, and when I started my career, I started in application engineering for a equipment supply company. And I progressed through application engineering, project engineering, and eventually as a sales engineer. And then in 1999, I left the UK and came across the Atlantic to the US and started again in sales, moved through the company in engineering, back to sales in a more, let's say, responsible role, managing a market for the business. And in 2013, I made the move to manage the service operation. For the time, that was GEA separation equipment.
And so I always like to ask this question, right? So it's interesting. You're an engineer like me, chemical engineer like me, which is why I like you, right? We have that in common. But you did the very typical career path in the early days as an engineer, which all of us did coming out of school. But then you went into sales and then you went into service. So, why those sales or why those customer facing moves, Chris?
I mean, that's perhaps a difficult question to answer now, but I think it was a natural progression. The business that I was in was more of a, let's say, bespoke engineered solutions business. So the salespeople were not typical salespeople, but technical people with an engineering background. And, having done that, I very much liked the customer interaction, what I saw as looking for a solution to a problem, if you like, rather than selling a product. And so that's really what I enjoyed doing.
But then the move into services in 2013, that's also from sales to services unusual, right? I mean, I hate to say this, but many of the salespeople have come across in my history of 20, 30 years of working in industry, they kind of look down upon service. But you took that role and kind of built up the service business. So what was the motivation to kind of do that?
Well, I think it was multifaceted, and I have to say I share your opinion. And it wasn't an easy decision because service was always seen as a little bit of the it's the other side of the business. But it was a significant portion of our business at the time, much bigger than the business that I was handling. So it was a career advancement opportunity. But moreover, I think it was an opportunity to bring that sales mindset into the service environment. Because up until that time, I think the service business, like many others, had been much more of a reactionary type operation. I guess we'll talk about that later on.
Yeah. Well, it's actually interesting, right? So back in the mid 90s, when I was at another large industrial conglomerate, we went through a similar transition where we took people like you and me who were more commercially minded, customer minded, and moved them into service leadership roles. And the intent or the thesis back then was like, look, service has to stop being a reactive wrench turning business into a proactive customer oriented customer success kind of mindset. And that's why I thought that was actually interesting that you came from sales into service or into aftermarket. Now, clearly, that was a promotion for you. And, clearly, as I watched GEA over the years, you guys have made aftermarket and service a big priority as part of the strategy of the company. How did that come about in terms of the strategy? I know there's been changes over time, but has service and aftermarket always been an important aspect of business for GEA?
It's always been very important. As an equipment supplier, we're putting equipment in the market that has a 30, 40 plus year lifespan. Obviously, it's important to maintain that equipment. So there's always been service has always been seen as a significant, important part of our business. But I think the change that really spurred the growth was to consider the two businesses as almost separate entities. And I don't want to suggest that service, new equipment sales, and the rest of the business did not work together as one unit, but the businesses were expected to stand on their own two feet, generate their own level of growth and profitability, etc. And I think that really drove home the need to be a bit more proactive in service.
So they made a big deal about services. They break the line item out for services, I think, most of the time when they report it. And it's been a big part. So we've seen that. Now, I'm going to ask you a slightly difficult question, the reverse of not why you took the job, but why do you think they chose you for the job? Because, again, in big corporations, you are quote unquote chosen for these jobs, right?
I figured you'd ask that, and I could say maybe they didn't have anybody else who's willing to do it. But no, look, I don't want to blow my own trumpet too much, but we had a very successful few years when I was leading the market that I was responsible for. We grew that business significantly, and I think they felt that they needed a leader who had a broad range of experience to support the service business, because it's a more complex business. You have a kind of operations business, but also a front end customer facing business.
Yeah. And actually, the reason I asked this question is not just to put you on the spot, but I think the point you made is important, right? Even in terms of moving from sales into services, service really inherently is truly the tip of the spear, if you may, that faces the customer, right? I mean, you could really do some great stuff with it, and you could really screw things up badly for your customer and therefore for yourself as a manufacturer.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
getting the right sales mindset is not just to sell more stuff, but a customer empathy mindset is really an important aspect of it, right? And I think that's why it's good to see people like you and some of the other guests we have and some of the people Chris, you've got to meet over the last executive advisory boards with us, right? They're actually very similar mindset like you, which I think is fascinating. It's a big change. Then when I think about Chris Sandiford in 2013 taking over the services job, you clearly were given a business and you had an agenda, you had some priorities to set. What were you? I mean, I know this is kind of rewinding back almost 10 years, but if you were to go back and say, okay, this was where the business was, and I was trying to take it to this point. There was some changes you were trying to do. So, what were the priorities you were trying to set for your team, broadly speaking, in the services world, aftermarket world?
Quite interestingly, and I think you touched on that, Vivek, a little bit, during your question, that service historically is seen as a reactionary business often, but also service is viewed by many, especially those on the sales side of the business, as the part of the company that fixes problems. When a customer has a problem, service comes and fixes those problems. And firstly, I would say that's absolutely not the approach that we want to take. And secondly, I would say that often is what drives this, perhaps a little bit of negative feeling, because whenever there's an issue or a problem, it's pushed to one part of the business. And if it's not solved immediately, okay, these guys are not performing. And I think what we really tried to do, other than having a customer-focused approach, was really to say, the service business, if you think service is about fixing a problem, then you already have created your problems. And service, to me, may sound like a cliche, but I always say service is about customer experience. We've sold this nice, shiny new machine, but it's going to sit in that customer's facility for the next 30 years. And when he comes to his decision about replacing that or buying another one, he's going to think about his experience over that time. So, the fact that the machine is reliable. If it breaks down, we've already failed in service, right? We shouldn't be fixing things. We should be preventing them breaking down. And moreover, he has to feel that he's got the support so that he doesn't worry about that piece of equipment, and it's an easy decision to replace it with the next one. So, I mean, that's the kind of proactive mindset, I guess. We're in. If the machine breaks down, we failed somewhere along the line because we haven't prevented it doing so.
What you said is actually an important aspect that gets overlooked almost every time I talk to these companies, right? So the notion that service is the one team that your customer and the user sees more often than anybody else through the life cycle is a largely overlooked fact. And the fact is that if you don't train the service people well, in not just in the proactive and preemptive repair or maintenance, but in terms of how to handle customer issues, right? That leaves a
Mhm.
lasting impression. I mean, look, the imprints on people's minds about how people were treated are not, and that is a big bearing on the future's purchase again, if you may. And I think that's an important learning or important observation you made, which is in terms of how people ought to think about service. So I really like what you just said, and I think that's an important lesson for most people. So
I
one of the
think
other
Vivek,
things, sorry, go ahead.
if I may pick up on that point, I
Yeah.
think your point's very well made about frequency of contact. And historically, your new equipment team drives the relationship with the customer. They're usually talking to the customer at a higher level. But service is the part of the business that's in frequent contact, would be in contact on a quarterly, biannual, annual basis for 30, 40 years. And so really it has the opportunity to build up that strong relationship with the customer. And our generally new equipment sales folks, I mean, of course, they build a relationship, they maintain contact with the customers, but they have a lot of irons in the fire and they can't necessarily be there as frequently. So I think we have an important role to play in promoting that relationship.
Yeah, and I think that's something I've been trying to emphasize with many of our customers, and in some of the work we talk, not necessarily customers, but hey, this relationship you build with service is a big deal. Don't overlook it, and use it for the best part you can for your business. So, the other thing we've noticed over time in the last definitely last 2 3 years, Chris, is as we spend time with both prospects and customers like you, I asked you the question about transformation in terms of what priorities you're trying to get. The big thing I've realized is there was a transformation you did. They got a sales oriented, customer oriented person in this service job. So there had to be some changes to happen. And one of the things we started putting together is what we call an aftermarket maturity assessment or aftermarket maturity framework. Candidly, like you said earlier, you're reactive, responded to service requests, service calls, or whatever it might be, on the way to being more proactive and preemptive about how you intentionally work with your customers to maximize the value of that asset out there. So that's, broadly speaking, it's a transformation journey, whether we acknowledge it or not. But there's also means that there was a what I would call a maturity level before and a maturity level after, right? And the maturity level before, most places that I see is, again, we all like to make up our own framework, so we call it a framework of level one, which is you're just
Mm-hmm.
reactive. People are inbound order takers. They don't do really proactive thinking, and it's all just break fix kind of things mindset. All the way to nirvana, which is proactive, preemptive, predictive. Where were you guys in that journey, and how did you move up those levels?
I think, I mean, it's thinking back now, I wouldn't say the business was wholly reactive, but it was very much reactive. And, actually, Vivek, when I think about that transition from sales into service, my biggest concern was that I would spend my evenings and weekends answering calls from customers because they were upset about something. But the reality is, when you start to take this proactive approach and you initiate the contact with the customer, you drive the business, of course, that doesn't happen because it's our job to prevent those problems happening. So, I mean, that's where we were. We moved that business in a way that, when you consider a service business, which is in our case more than 50% of the annual revenue for the company, it's really a little bit strange when you say that, well, we've got a whole big service team promoting our new equipment, sorry, sales team, but we don't have a sales team promoting service. This is big
Mm,
business with customers. We need to get
mm,
out there, talk to people, discuss their needs and wants and so on. So that was one big change to actually promote a sales activity. And I think the other part of the approach is really trying to capture a larger portion of the business because, again, a reactive business, you get a lot of phone calls from customers. They want to buy spare parts or ad hoc service, and that's great. Spare parts are pretty lucrative for most companies, and the risk is low. But of course, now we're selling a commodity. We're open to a lot of potential competition from the grey market and others, and moreover, we don't know what happens when those spare parts leave our possession, right? And what I tried to do in the organization was to say we want to capture the end-to-end service so that we can provide that ownership experience to the customer to ensure that not only do they have the right parts, they're doing service frequently enough, they're optimizing the performance of the machine, they're aware of any innovations, they know when they have something that's, let's say, in need of replacement. So it was about broadening the scope of our touch points with the customers too.
It's interesting you said what you did, right? So you go back to the frequency comment we made earlier, a frequency observation, which is there's a higher frequency of touch points with a customer in the life cycle. And what you were trying to do, I think, is also recognize that and use that both from the service point of view, from the sales point of view as well, to capture more of what they did instead of going to third parties or competition or whoever. My guess, but the most obvious question that comes to mind is then, Chris, clearly, as you said in this journey, you were at a point of performance that was, say, level A. You got to level B, which hopefully, presumably, was higher. How did that manifest itself? I mean, again, I don't need numbers, but you mentioned, and broadly speaking, GEA 50% is service. Was it similar in separation when you started, or lower, and you took it to a higher number over those years you were
Well,
general manager of the business?
yeah, I mean, across the organization, different divisions have different splits based on the equipment and their approach. I mean, we over the years where I was responsible for service, we grew that business significantly. I would say from somewhere below half of the business, we doubled the service revenue
Wow,
in 10 years.
wow,
I think the other thing to really emphasize is service business is a lot more predictable and stable than your new equipment business. I don't want to say it's recession proof, but you don't see the huge fluctuations. And so when we're facing a situation like we are today, some storm clouds on the horizon, right? Some potential, I don't know about contraction, but maybe slowdown in the market. If you have a solid service business and a solid installed base, that can help carry you through those uncertain times. And I think that's the why the company is stronger today than it was, because you have that much larger contribution from that stable and high margin business.
Can I just pick on that topic for a second? I actually interviewed somebody who was in a private equity owned enterprise recently, and just left. They sold the business, or they were part of the sale process. And the thesis that the private equity owner, the sponsor, had was exactly what you just said, which is aftermarket is high margin. Aftermarket is recurring slash revenue that keeps maintaining in a steady manner through parts and service and contractual agreements, and therefore gives them a better valuation multiple over time. And so as you kind of make the shift from just selling lumpy sales of equipment, we all know these lumpy sales that come about when a big project kicks in, and this crazy quarter, the next quarter goes down. The service
Hmm.
business kind of gives you a solid base on which to build on. And yes, whether it's recession proof or not, but there's definitely financial benefits in terms of how investors value the company as well, right? So that was an interesting observation the other guests in the private equity side made. When you think about the performance change you had, you hired salespeople, you put some promotion in place, you kind of got this thing going, you got the business going. Now, you and I both know this, but this is not very commonplace, what you just described. People
Evidently
thinking that
not.
way, right?
Hmm.
Was that?
Evidently not.
Evidently, yes, evidently not. And I can promise you it's definitely not, because we see this time and time again. So my question for you is, it's a bit unfair, but I'm going to ask you this question. So what advice would you give either the leadership of these companies or people like you who've been promoted into a role and say, look, these are the things I would do if I were you because of A, B, and C, right? How do you
Well,
get them to get out of the discomfort, make them uncomfortable and do this stuff?
I think I would refer to the point we just talked about, that this is good for the business, right? This is a good, it's a safeguard for business
Yeah.
fluctuations. Again, it's high revenue. I think that if you look at your business and you divide it into your new equipment business and your after sales business, and you consider the value of those, I mean, depending on, after sales could be a significant part of your revenue. And then you have to ask yourself, what makes you think that you can grow this business without having a dedicated sales team focused on that? And maybe they don't have to be dedicated, but they've got to be focused on those products.
Right.
And thereafter, I would say, think about what the customer needs, because more and more we're seeing customers who, like us, they struggle to find service people, they struggle to find maintenance people, they have budgets to deal with, headcount cuts and all that, and they are less able to take care of the equipment that they have. And so if we can offer a broader range of services and really help them to optimize their business, not just keep the units running, but optimize the performance and get the greatest value out of that, now we're really providing value to our customers. So that's about broadening the scope of service, not just spare parts and wrench turning, but it's really about making sure that ownership experience from beginning to end is the best one for the customer, and that they get the best value out of the equipment that they bought.
You're a very typically modest chap, Chris, but I was hoping to get a very selfish answer that said, "Look, the performance of the business was so good that you can use that as a stepping stone to really showcase your leadership jobs to say how you took a business from A to B, right?" And in some ways, candidly, that was a setup for you to get promoted to the president role that you had, right? You did these customer things, you build the commercial side of the business, you use the customer experience journey to kind of make your customers stickier or more prone to go to
Mm-hmm.
GEA. And that has an impact on the performance of the business. And look, I was a corporate guy like you a long time ago. Performance gets recognized in terms of promotion capabilities or promotion times. And to me, that's actually one of the interesting ways to do it, right? And I actually look at this journey you've been on to say, look, you took something, you made it better, and therefore you got recognized for it in terms of a new promotion. So again, you're modest, but I think I look at this as saying, hey, there's a different way to become a corporate hero through the aftermarket business, right? And that's kind of one of the
Absolutely.
lessons here.
Yeah, I mean, can I say money talks? We drove a lot of
Yeah.
revenue. But I think we were able to implement, not only implement, but also promote, drive corporate corporate wide initiatives that really pushed our service business in the right direction. So we took the initiative and really pushed ahead and tried things that maybe more traditional service businesses would not do. And I think that gets some attention, right? We grew because
Yeah.
we did the right things. It wasn't just luck, but of course we had a good team who were focused on the right things as well.
And again, harkening back to my corporate life, or even today as an entrepreneur, as I'm promoting people, I promote people who deliver results, right? I mean, we promote people. We got promoted in our career because we deliver results, and I think that's the other part. Is these results are meaningful in most companies, or can be meaningful in most companies, and if you deliver meaningful results, people are going to notice and get you promoted. So, with that as a setup, you got promoted to be president of the heating and refrigeration division. I guess 9 months ago now, almost a year ago, September last year, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
How has that journey been for you? How has that shift back into the equipment side been for you?
You know what? It's a great opportunity for me. I'm really enjoying it. We have a fantastic business. It's a little bit more of a complex business because we are a manufacturing operation. We also have, of course, have sales and service. So we have the complete package here in North America. A little bit more, perhaps, independent than one of some of the other divisions. And we have a very long history and a strong business and a lot of opportunities ahead. I know that you're going to ask me about the service business, and I would say that coming into that organization, I see some things in the service business that I saw when I moved into the other role, and so I'm also excited about implementing some of the things that we did because I know they worked, and I know they can work here as well. So, and we can sustain our business and make it more stable by driving service to be a large part of our overall business while we continue to explore new markets for new equipment.
When you think about, you've been, like I said, almost a year now, and you mentioned some interesting things in the experience and services, right? You talked about customer facing, empathy, and understanding the experience. You understood the value of letting the customer sleep well at night through some of the stuff you did proactively and preemptively to so versus reactive. You talked about putting a commercial mindset despite all these customers things. You kind of have to think about making money and growing the business. And we talked about performance, right? I mean, at the end, performance is what gets you promoted. Have you been able to translate those lessons, or are you beginning to implement those lessons into your new role and new division now, or is that some of these are already there that you're just trying to enhance? Where are you
Well,
on
I
that?
think It's a combination of both, Vivek. I mean, we have driven the service business in double-digit growth this year, which I think is
Nice.
pretty good. And I think we have room to grow further.
Yeah.
I think we've also, with the help of some really good team members, we've made it clear that service is not they don't sit in the basement and take the phone calls, right? They are part of leading the charge in our business, part of, driving sales to the customer. And what we are trying to implement and what we will implement is a much more proactive and data-driven approach to service sales, because there again is an area where I think we have room for improvement.
Excellent. Now, when you think about the next couple of years, 2 3 years, if you may, in terms of the heating and refrigeration business, what are the priorities you've set for the company? What are the leadership experience you've taken from aftermarket and service over the last decade into this new role? Is it shifting things in terms of priorities, or kind of enhancing these things a bit more?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I talked about data-driven sales, and I really think there's an opportunity across the organization to be a little bit more, data-driven, right? Let's
Yeah.
let's shift our sales approach away from being the kind of ad hoc, dashing in all directions, squirrel chasing a shiny ball, to saying, let's be data-driven, let's be focused, let's be organized, right? Let's also consider some innovative approaches. We did some things in service in my previous role that had never been done before, or not in that way by us. And I think we have an opportunity to do that here. And so, again, it's really about implementing some of the things we did in the past, but also taking advantage of some of the particulars of this business, which is in a slightly different part of the industry.
When I think about my experience with you the last couple of years now, and looking or listening to your career story, there's a few things that I picked up along the way. Right, one is the fact that, like many engineers, you started in engineering but moved into a commercial thing. It's a mindset thing. By the way, I call myself a failed engineer, and my wife will concur heartily with that. Which is, I studied engineering, but does no means I'm an engineer. I'm very much a customer first, people first kind of person. So I think that's a big part of it, right? Kind of getting into the business that lets you be your people person. You are commercially minded, as in trying to figure out how to grow the business, and then you're trying to make sure that you're delivering service, because at the end, those long relationships are what gets you repeat business over time. If I were to ask you, and this is an unfair question, Chris, but I like to always ask these questions to people like you've been around a couple of years in a couple of different roles. Is, again, this is not to opine or editorialize on what doesn't happen, but I don't see that as such commonplace occurrence in most companies today. It is still, unfortunately, the domain of break fix, reactive. Yes, it's there. I wouldn't say an afterthought, but almost, right? So, I mean, the question I have for you is, Chris, you and I see this, and there's many of us who see this, and maybe it's self-selecting that the customers I have are people like you and others who actually see it, and therefore we kind of work together. Why is it that I'd say a good 90% of the industry is still in this ancient mode, to put it bluntly? Right? It's an
That's
awkward and difficult question, but what the heck, right?
That's a difficult question to answer. I mean, change takes a long time. We hang on to our traditional views of the businesses, and often those businesses are separated, either within the organization or even geographically. And I think you touched on this at the very beginning, right? The customer focused, I don't know, relationship orientated people don't necessarily see service as an opportunity to grow their careers. And no disrespect to anybody in the organization, but often service business is populated by people who have always been in service, and consequently that the idea of change is maybe a little bit of a challenge. So I think it's about mixing people up as well as recognizing the opportunities. It's also about it's really about knowing your data as well, because
Right.
often we don't have the tools available to really say, how we're going to drive this business. We don't know what's out there.
Yeah, and I think that you're right about these things. And I again go back deep dark into my career. 25, 26 years ago, at the large conglomerate I was at, they made an explicit decision to start taking the best and the brightest and move them into service, because he knew that without that, you would never get the change that they wanted to get done, right? Which is, once you put the leader in place. I mean, as I say, I mean, maybe there's a wrong phrase, but the fish rots from his heads down. But the same token, the fish grows, or the body grows from the head up, right? And they started putting interesting, maybe aggressive is the wrong word, but progressive leaders in place in each of these service businesses, and actually made a huge difference to that company. And I think that's really part of the challenge. But it goes back to what you said: is if people don't see the value, if people don't see the monetary relationship between service and growth and margin, and don't recognize the value it brings to from the company's valuation perspective, they will not make these choices about putting the A players in the best jobs. And that's one of the things I think I've taken away from listening to you and some of the others, is that A players are the ones who are going to make a difference. They'll get promoted, and it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I do mean it in a really important way, that the customers we have, for the most part, Chris, are people like you, who are what I would call progressive, forward-thinking people who've taken chances with their careers to kind of go get some things done, and then they get rewarded for it because they know that they're making a difference to the company's performance. And I think that's a big message that I think I want to make sure people take away, is that this is not the old backwaters. This is actually a really big promotion opportunity for everybody if you do it right.
Yeah. And of course, I think people who've had a long career in service also have something to offer the company in other groups. So it's important to get that exchange both ways. I have heard it said many times by people who have expected something different from that. Well, we sell equipment, and when they need service, they have to phone us. Okay. Well, that's great. It's great that you have a business where you don't have any competition, but think about what that means for customer experience, and think about what it means when the competition arrives, right? You're not set up to tackle that. And that could happen overnight. History is littered with companies who took that kind of approach. And then furthermore, when we talk about what we want to do in terms of customer service, who do we compare ourselves with? Are we comparing ourselves with our competitors in the same industry? Or are we comparing ourselves with those people who are at the top of the customer service ladder, right? And typically they would not be industrial companies. They might be consumer goods companies. But why don't we look at what they do and try to bring some of that into the industrial market?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a mindset shift. Well, Chris, it's been an interesting 30 minutes to talk to you, but I'm going to do, as I mentioned before the call, that, I get inspired. I'm inspired by Guy Raz and his famous How I Built This series, and now a whole bunch of spinoffs. And I love the question he always asks at the end of the show, right? Chris, you look back at a career, and how much of it do you ascribe to luck? And how much of it do you ascribe to Chris's brilliance, right? Innate skills.
I'll give you an honest answer. I mean, look, a lot of things in life are due to being in the right place at the right time. But it's also about knowing that you're in the right place at the right time and seizing the opportunity. So
That's right.
It's a balance. It's a balance.
That's right. No, I agree with that. I mean, I think there's always, I look back sometimes on my career and say, man, I was in the right place at the right time. And I got that break. Exactly. But like you said, I took that break and ran with it, right? And that's a big difference.
You can put yourself in the right place at the right time. So you have control over your own destiny, but of course,
that's right.
The environment conspires to support that.
That's right. Well, excellent. Well, Chris, this was a great conversation. I think I took away a lot from it in terms of the focus on customers and experiences, the ability to think commercially, the making sure you have the touch points and take advantage of them over time. And at the end, like you said, you put yourself in a position to win, you drive the performance, and that performance gets recognized to give you chances to go get promoted. So this is a really, really good conversation. I enjoyed it. I'm sure listeners are going to take a lot out of it. So I really appreciate you taking the time today, Chris, to spend an important part of your day with me today. So thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Vivek. Always a pleasure, and I hope it was interesting for you and the listeners.
Yes. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.